Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us again for another episode of the Alex Hayes Podcast. I am your host, Alex Hayes, and joining me today is Dr. Phil Trimble. He is here. He is a doctor of veterinary medicine, and he is here as an entrepreneur. He has multiple exits under his belt. He is here to share words of wisdom and on his journey, how he's built his businesses and how he also exited his company successfully. And I am so grateful that he is here today to share this wisdom with our audience. So, Phil, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And my pleasure. So let's talk. Let's talk about those early days before maybe we get into anything like too technical. Who was Phil in high school?
Well, I was kind of half nerd, half jock. I did letter in 3 different sports, but I was also a National Merit Scholarship finalist. So I guess I kind of filled in two slots there.
So classic overachiever.
Well, I am the oldest of 6 kids, so yeah, but typical first child.
There you go. There you go. All right. Help shed some light on the situation here. So how did you get into being a veterinarian, and when did you discover that this was your path?
So my dad was a veterinarian, so I always kind of grew up, kind of thinking that's what I wanted to do. And kind of the older I got, the more I leaned that direction. In all honesty, my dad kind of tried to push me away a couple of times. He's like, "Did you ever think about something else? He'd being a XYZ or whatever." And I said, "Well, yeah, I kind of thought about that, but that's not really what I want to do." It was just, he was a veterinarian, and that's what I wanted to do. And I was fortunate enough to be able to get into school and graduate and join him in the practice.
Awesome. And so would you say that being exposed to being entrepreneur and a veterinarian early in your life kind of helped shape and mold your direction?
Yeah, I would say so. My dad was involved in a couple of things that were pretty new at the time. He went to work for another veterinarian fresh out of school, and then that veterinarian helped him set up his own clinic, and they developed kind of a satellite program where the surgery and the x-ray machine and stuff like that stayed at the main clinic, and he was in this satellite clinic that he owned and operated, but didn't have to buy all the expensive equipment, didn't have to have a surgery suite, didn't have to have an x-ray machine. We would just go up the street to where the main clinic was. And then in the mid-'60s, he and 5 other veterinarians opened the second in the nation emergency clinic. So that, back in those days, if you had a vet clinic, you were on call every night. If one of your patients got sick, they would call you and you would go meet them at the clinic and deal with it. If it was an emergency, they'd get hit by a car, cut this foot, or, whatever it was. And they opened this clinic, this emergency specialty facility in the mid-'60s, and then they would alternate. One of them would be on call each night for all 6 clinics. So now you went from being on call every night to being on call essentially once a week. A little bit more than that, but basically once a week you had to be on call. And then the rest of the nights, that if someone called your clinic, the phone would ring at this specialty hospital, this emergency clinic, and there would be a doctor there waiting to see them. So that was a fairly new concept back then. So the entrepreneurial part of it, I kind of grew up seeing my dad do some entrepreneurial things like that.
That's fascinating. And that was cutting edge. That was revolutionary for the time.
Yes, very much so.
Wow. That's impressive. So how do you feel like that imprinted on you when you wanted to join the practice?
So when I first joined, I just came on and it was kind of a same thing, an interesting concept. I joined the practice as, at the time, he had another partner, and they were sole proprietors sharing space. So they each had their own client base, and they would see each other's patients on their days off. So you could have a day off. The clinic didn't have to close. You could still have the clinic open, and the other doc would see your patients. And then I joined, and they kind of made me that person. I would see Dr. Swearingen's patients on his day off. I would see my dad's patients on his day off. And at least the first few years, I didn't have a lot to do, but when I had a day off, they would see mine. And in exchange for that, and I would do that at a relatively low cost. I think I got 22% of what I grossed on their patients, and they would get the rest. They would get the other, 78%. And then in exchange for that, I got to build my own practice at very low. I didn't have to buy in. My buy-in was my labor, and I was able to build a practice. They gave me every third new client that came in that didn't specifically ask for one of the other doctors. If they just come in and say, "I don't care who I see," I got every third one of those, and I was able to build a practice. The first couple of years, I had a second job. I was working nights as an ER doc at that facility we just talked about. By that point, by the time I graduated, they were hiring the night staff, so they didn't have to be on call at all. Or maybe once or twice a month they would be on call, because the rest of the time it was hired by a, a night doctor, an emergency veterinarian. So I was working two jobs, 4 nights a week at that clinic, and then a full-time job at the day clinic, so I could actually pay some bills while I was building a practice. But I was able to build a practice just off of labor, not having to buy in. So it was a pretty big deal for me. And again, kind of cutting edge. That not nobody was doing that kind of thing back then. But just seeing some of the things that they did, some of the chances they were willing to take, I think that made a difference for me. Down the road, I wound up buying a couple of other practices and folding them into my practice. We wound up the building that we were in, I think, was about 4,000 square feet, and I'm talking about the emergency clinic now. In '99. I put together a coalition of doctors of about 30 doctors, and we built another newer facility that was about 10,000 square feet.
Wow.
So I think all of that early exposure to let's take some chances, but let's make sure they make sense before we do, allowed me to be able to pull the trigger on some of those things.
That's awesome. Before I had to have questions about your acquisition strategy for one, but before that, I don't want to gloss over the fact that you were entering your father's business, who had another business partner, or essentially a quasi business partner relationship. How was it working with your father? Because there's some people that don't work well with their father. There's some people
Yeah.
that don't work well with family members in general, right? How was that for you? And what did you guys do that made it work?
So I think the fact that we were still sole proprietors sharing space, because I entered the practice the same way. I would have my own practice, my own clients, and I could essentially practice medicine the way I wanted to. My dad didn't come in and say, "Hey, why didn't you handle this way?" Because it wasn't his client, it wasn't his patient, and he was very good about not letting me, not getting after me. I didn't do it exactly the way he does. But by the same token, I also was entering into a practice where I had two guys with, gosh, at that point, my dad had 25 years of experience and Jack had 20, Jack Swearingen. And so between the two of them, I had guys that I could go, "Hey, I'm thinking about this. What do you think about that? Can you look at this x-ray for me? Help me make a decision here." So I had some good help, but they were both willing to let me do whatever I was doing on my own patients because they were mine. They weren't their patients.
Yeah. And so you came into the business as basically your own sole proprietorship on equal footing as far as a business stature went, and it allowed you to have a little bit more autonomy, but still work collaboratively. Does that sound right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Mm. I like that. I like that. And did you have a good working relationship with your father?
Yeah, I did. I mean, number one, I admired him for the work he did, and obviously, I mean, that's what I wanted to do myself. And he was very willing to help me out if I asked a question, but he was also pretty willing to leave me alone if I didn't have a question. I mean, the fact I think that I was, a reasonably talented doctor, I wasn't making a whole lot of big mistakes or anything, so I think that helped that he could see what I was doing as I first joined the practice and see that I was competent. And so from that standpoint, it made it easier for him to be able to cut me loose.
I like it. I like it. So let's transition. You mentioned that you had sounded like a fairly aggressive acquisition strategy for growth. Talk to us through what made you think acquisition was the right way to go, and then what went well with that plan, and what were some of the lessons that you learned along the way that surprised you?
Well, I guess first of all, I learned, or at least I think I learned, maybe this isn't true, but I believed it to be true, that if you want to do well, you need to either have other people working for you or need to have other people's money working for you. In the case of buying real estate and they're paying rent to you, or you've got other doctors working for you, whatever it is, that's how you really develop wealth. Just if you're just working on your own, unless you're a genius and you come up with some brilliant idea that nobody else has, and you can sell that idea, you either need to have other people working for you or other people's money working for you, or both. And so I realized pretty early on that I wanted to expand the practice to the point where I was hiring doctors to work, that I couldn't do all the work myself. I think the first practice that I bought was actually one of the partners in that emergency facility. He was older, about my dad's age, and where he had his practice, he didn't own the building, and they were going to jack his rent way up. And he's like, man, I don't know if I want to do that. I'm close to retirement. And I said, Gene, why don't you come join us? You can practice out of our facility, and let's start talking about me buying you out. And so he thought that was a great idea. He came over, he joined. And so he was the fourth sole proprietor sharing space, brought his practice over with most of his clients. He was a good enough doc and a good enough person that most of his clientele followed him, even though it was probably about 5 miles from where his old practice was to where the new practice was, maybe 4 or 5 miles, somewhere in there, which people were actually driving by maybe 3 or 4 vet clinics to get to where he was. But, he had enough loyal clientele that they would do that. So he came over, he worked with us as a sole proprietor for a couple of years. And then I made him an offer to buy him out. And essentially the numbers worked out to where I could take the money that I made from his practice, essentially give him 100% of it, of the profit for 3 years, and then I would own the practice. And so that worked out pretty well. I didn't have to put up any money down front. I think I put up 10% down front, wasn't a lot. And I paid him going rate for the practice at that point. Back then, the multiples were about 1-time gross. And so I paid him that. And in about 3 to 4 years, I made exactly the same amount of money I was making before. I was working twice as hard, but in 3 years, then I now had 2 practices, and the 100% of the profit now was going into my pocket. And at that point, I was able to hire a doctor basically to run that practice. Gene worked for me part-time for a couple of years, and then I hired a doctor to run that practice, and it worked out great.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And how many practices did you end up buying?
Ultimately, I just wound up buying 2, and then bought my dad out of his, and then I ran it for about 5 years that way, and then I sold it.
Which exit are we, when you say you sold it? Which business is this the first business you sold?
So the specialty hospital that we talked about earlier, we sold that in 2015. And at that point, there were 7 partners. We had previously bought out some of the other minority partners that had joined us when we built a new building about 6 or 7 years in. Some of the people they were mostly doctors that bought in, but some of them weren't using the facility as the central hospital. They had their own surgery facility. They had their own x-ray machine. They were just owners of the business. And so we bought them out of that around 2010. We built it in 1999. About 2010, we bought them out. So there were, I think, 8 or 9 of us that still own the business in 2015. And we sold that business to VCA. It's a big hospital. They own thousands of hospitals around the country. Anywhere you go, you're going to see VCA, whatever. They rename it. So their name is in part of the name.
So you guys built this business, built this animal hospital, to a point in which you sold it to a larger conglomerate.
Yes.
And talk to me about that process. Let's dive in a little bit. I'm very fascinated. I want to know your experience with selling to a larger firm, larger corporation. How did that process go for you? Like, where did it start?
So around that time, 2015, I was the youngest of I think, again, there were 9 partners at that point. I was the youngest. And let's see, 2015 was 11 years ago. So I was in my mid 50s, 56. And we had some partners that were in their 70s, and they were like, it's time for me to get out of this business. I want to retire. So we talked about it, and we decided it was time to sell. And at that time, there were several companies that were buying practices. ECA was one of the big ones. And there were a couple others, Blue Pearl, Blue River, and a couple other big ones. But not all of them were willing to buy an emergency specialty clinic. At that point, we had more than just emergencies. We also had, I think, of 5 specialty doctors working during the day, a couple of surgeons, a couple of internal medicine docs, an oncologist, and we also had a critical care specialist at that point. And actually, by that time, we had a part-time dentist as well, a veterinary dentist. So there were only a couple of companies that were buying those types of hospitals. The regular general practices, you had multiple entities that were willing to look at you. But at that time, there were only couples. Did some cold calling, called a couple of those companies to say, hey, I know you're buying hospitals like ours. Are you interested in buying ours? And a couple of them were, and they came and looked and kicked around and swapped numbers and made some bids. VCA was the biggest number, and so we looked at them pretty hard and wound up signing a contract with them.
Interesting. So you went the outbound. So you knew that you wanted to get out, or your partners collectively all said we were ready to get out. We know the market. We identified who is our target buyer, and then you went out and called those prospects yourself to see if anybody had interest, and you were actually spot on. So talk to me a little bit about that due diligence process, because when you said that they showed up and they looked around, can you elaborate on that a little bit more? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they want to see what the facility looks like, but the big thing they want to look at numbers. Are you guys making a profit? What's it look like for the last couple of years? Are you growing? Are you desperate to sell because you're cratering? Those kinds of the typical business stuff. And they talk with some of the staff. What's the chances if we buy this place that these doctors are going to stay? That kind of thing. Obviously, the worst case scenario for them is they buy the practice and then all the docs leave.
Yeah, that would not be good for them. So
Yeah.
what were some of those other key questions that you can remember that they were asking?
For me, as an owner selling, they didn't ask me a lot of those questions because the stuff that they wanted to know that I would be able to answer, they wanted to look at the books. So they weren't asking me, are you guys profitable? They were looking at the books to see, are we profitable? Um, I was the only one that might have been willing to stay and work for them. At the time, I was director of medicine for that facility. And but their model, the director of medicine also had to work as a doctor there. And the only position I would have been qualified to do would be an ER doc. And I had no interest at all in being an ER doc and working nights and weekends. So I wasn't really even eligible to retain the position that I had as director of medicine. So they didn't really ask me a lot of those questions. As soon as when they came in and said, hey, do you want to stay? And I said, well, I'd be willing to. We'd have to talk numbers. And they said, well, if you do stay, you'll have to be an ER doc. And I said, well, in that case, no, I'm not willing to stay. And that was kind of the end of that conversation. And then the rest of it, they just looked at numbers. The conversations they had with the docs that they did want to retain, I wasn't privy to those conversations. So
Interesting. So very, very, very numbers heavy. At the time, do you remember what kind of steps they took to validate those numbers? Like, did they just take the numbers, or did they have auditors come in and look at the books? Do you remember any of that process?
yeah, I mean, we gave them tax returns. They got tax returns, I think, for 5 years. They talked with our CPA that did the tax returns. They talked with our in-house bookkeeper. We were all online at that point. We had a software system called Cornerstone, so they were able to look into Cornerstone and pull up the numbers. Mars Corporation at that time owned VCA hospitals, and so you're talking about pretty big time business guys that know what they're doing when they come in to do acquisitions, because Mars obviously has done multiple acquisitions over time. And so they knew what reports they wanted to pull out of the practice software and all that. So they pulled whatever reports they wanted. They looked at tax returns. They looked at everything.
Interesting. Did you guys do any prep work before you started making these cold calling? Was there any kind of pre-diligence work per se that you guys were doing on yourselves to make sure you were ready to have this process and start this process?
We didn't, and we probably should have. I mean, the reality is none of us really knew what we were doing at the time. We just, especially some of the older guys, just knew they wanted to get out. I was equivocal. I would have been happy to stay in, but I certainly didn't have the money that would have taken to buy out the 5 guys that really wanted out, and wasn't really interested in taking on that much workload myself. I was already splitting time between my general practice and being director of medicine for the facility. And honestly, my practice did suffer because I wasn't there full time. So I realized that at that point, I kind of needed to, pull the trigger on this anyway, just so I could get back and devote the time to my practice that it deserved. So I don't think we even knew enough, to be honest, to do some prep work. But certainly, knowing what I know now, we could have taken a year or two to make the place as profitable as possible. There's people you can hire to come in and look at those types of things. And if you get the right person, they more than make up for it by the multiple when they come in and make you a bid for your practice, the multiples they were using at that point, it wouldn't take much to make those people make their money back, make the money back that you had to pay them to come in and streamline your processes.
I love it. I love it. That's super great insight and wisdom. So you go through this process, and how long did this whole process take for a bigger company to come and evaluate the opportunity to close? What would you say was that length of time?
It was just under a year. I think we started making calls around the fall of 2014. Got some bids back around December of 2014, and then once we decided that we wanted to go with VCA, it was about 10 months for them to really come in, do their due diligence, get us contracts, have us review the contracts, because they didn't buy the building, so we had to have a lease that we reviewed and all that kind of stuff as well. A little over a year from the time we made the decision to do it, a little under a year from the design, we decided who we were going to do it with.
So that about a 12-month process. I think that's pretty good for going through. That sounded like a pretty complicated operation with multiple layers and multiple doctors and evaluating the whole thing. I think that sounds very reasonable. Do you do you remember? So now you're saying you brought up real estate. How did real estate play into the talks of that negotiation?
Not a lot. I mean, it's pretty common at that level. Those companies don't want to own the real estate, so they almost always will buy the building and buy the practice and do a lease back for the building.
And who owned the building? Was that everybody? Like,
Yeah, it was the same group of people that owned the practice. Yeah, we actually, I guess that's thinking back, that's probably the one thing we did in preparation for selling was to spin the real estate off into a separate corporation. So now that you bring that up, we did that in advance of starting to make the calls because we knew going in that most of those companies didn't want to buy the real estate. And so having it as two separate corporations made it easier for us.
yeah, that sounds pretty smart. So you got your check. You guys were all happy with the deal. I take it.
Yeah, I think we got a fair price. That we were happy with the deal. I will say, again, knowing what I know now, that we would have used a different lawyer. The lawyer that we used was just our regular lawyer. And having gone through this process a second time with my general practice, and having been referred to a lawyer that does these deals a lot and had specifically closed deals with the company that I wound up selling to multiple times, I think the contract review was better. It was smoother. She knew exactly what to look for. Knew exactly what was going to be negotiable, what wasn't going to be negotiable. We ultimately wound up doing a 5-year lease, and we found out later that was not standard. That generally they'll do a 7 to 9 year lease as their first lease. So it didn't make any difference because they wound up staying after that 5 years. But knowing what we know now, somebody that was familiar with the process and familiar with closing with that particular company would have known, hey, why are they only giving you 5 years on this first lease? We need to figure that one out and go from there. So again, it ultimately didn't make much difference because at the end of the 5 years, they re-upped for another 5 anyway. But I think we would have done a little bit better in the negotiations if we had someone who had been through that process before.
Interesting. That's a great point. And since you're bringing up going, as your advisory team, who made up your advisory team going through that first process?
Well, we didn't have one. It was just us. It was just the docs that owned the practice. And we had our regular lawyer that had done our normal stuff. We had them review the contracts. And I'm not saying they did a bad job. I think we didn't get cheated or anything. We just, I think, didn't know enough to maybe push in a couple places where we could have pushed to get a little bit better deal. Just because, again, the second time I went through it, I had a lawyer that not only had closed a bunch of these deals, they had closed several of these deals with the company that I was dealing with.
Wow. Awesome. So now let's transition this a little bit then. So you've gone through this first transaction selling to a big corp, and now you're back in your private practice. How was that? How did that feel to go from being so maybe stretched thin to now being able to focus back on your general practice?
So it was mixed. I mean, it was a relief in that now I didn't have all the headaches and hassles of dealing with the other facility, including, as director of medicine, I was doing all the hiring and firing of docs. And if one of the docs, wanted some time off, I had to deal with trying to find coverage for their shifts, et cetera, et cetera. So that part was good. I'd been part of that hospital since 1983, and my dad had been part of the hospital since the mid 60s. So it's a little hard to, I've been walking into that building on a regular basis for, you know, a long, long time. And all of a sudden, I can't just walk in whenever I want. But yeah, for the most part, it was a positive thing. By that point, by the time we actually closed, I was ready to sell.
Let me dig into that just a little bit more if you allow me to here. When you
Yeah.
say ready to sell, what was the vision of your life that you wanted to look like after that first sale? What were you running towards?
So I think at that point, I had a little bit better handle on, what the multiples were the companies were paying for practices. I had a pretty good feel for where my practice was going to be valued. Shortly after that sale, I sat down with my financial advisor and said, this is where we're at. What would this look like if I sold my practice? In the next couple, 3 years, and this is the number that I think I could get for the practice. What does this look like? And in all honesty, it looked good. I probably could have retired at that point, selling the practice and been relatively happy. Although at that point I was, in my mid 50s and I wasn't quite ready to sell, quite ready to retire. Let's put it that way. I think it freed me up to focus exclusively on my practice. At that point, my dad was getting close to wanting to sell. Actually, by that point, I'd already bought my dad out. I'm sorry, I bought him out in 2010. We sold this practice in 2015, so I'd already bought my dad out. I had, at that point, 3 doctors working for me. So I had about a 3.5-man practice. Jack Swearingen was still practicing, so he had his. And at that point, it was about a 1.5-man practice. He had cut to halftime and had another doctor working for him. So that's what, I guess, 5 docs working out of the building, but I had 2/3 of the practice. He had 1/3 of the practice. Again, we were still proprietors sharing space, but mine was about twice as big as his. But I think it gave me a pretty good feel for what was possible. I knew at that point that I could work as long as I wanted to, but when I got ready to sell, I could sell and be financially stable and not worry about, what I was going to do to pay the bills.
That sounds pretty important, right? Making sure that you have enough cash runway and that you're financially stable to be able to walk away at any time. And you had it sounds like a lot of conversations with your financial advisor about that topic.
Yeah, and my other partner, Jack, the other sole proprietor, he was getting close to retirement. He was fond of telling a joke. He would say, "Yeah, I met with my financial advisor last week, and I said, hey, I want to retire next year." And he said, "Well, let me run some numbers." And he came back about a week later. So, well, I got good news and bad news. The good news is you can retire next year. The bad news is just 3 years after that, you'll have to go back to work. So, I mean, it was a joke because he was doing well, but it was important, to sit down and run the numbers and make sure that when you do sell, you can live the life you want to live, that you're not going to have to downsize and, quit traveling and that kind of thing to make ends meet.
Let me poke a little bit more on that one because I think this is financial security. I think is a big topic today with baby boomer generation now looking at retirement. Most boomers are now between 65 and 75, right? And so they and still make up the majority of business owners today. What should they be having in that conversation with maybe their financial planner, or if they don't have a financial planner, what conversations do you think that they need to be having with their spouse or with their loved ones uh, to be able to feel more at peace about what financial security means?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if you're counting on selling your business and that's your retirement plan, that you need to have a financial advisor. You need to have someone that can run the numbers and say, okay, if you get X amount for this business, and are you going to continue to work for them when when you sell, or are you going to? And in my case, the answer is almost always yes. You have to, because most of the companies that want to buy businesses like mine want you to hang around for a while. They're not going to pay you as much to buy the practice if you're out the door the minute that the check clears the bank. In my case, I agreed to work 2 days a week for 3 years for the corporation that I sold to, which was fine. I had already cut to about 2 days a week anyway, so I basically was able to continue working what I was working. So I was fine with that. That was part of the negotiations, that I wouldn't work more than I was already working. But yeah, I think if your exit strategy is selling this business is going to be a substantial portion of my retirement, then you need to get some advice on how to sell, when to sell, what to do before you sell, And what do these numbers make sense as they stand right now? And if not, what do we have to do to make the numbers make sense?
Hmm. That's powerful. And it sounds like though that there's a few different people involved with that, not just a financial planner. It sounded like you just rattled off a few different types of experts. Who should be the first conversation?
Well, I think if you don't have any idea what your business is worth, you need to find a way to do that. In my case, it was pretty easy. Most of the companies that are looking to buy practices are willing to come in and do a valuation on your practice and tell you what they think it's worth. So, uh, honestly, the first time I did that was shortly after we sold this 2015 business. And I began to think about, okay, what's this going to look like? At some point, I'm going to sell mine. And at the time, I had an associate that was interested in buying. So I said, great, let's get a number. Let's find out what that number is going to be. And so I made a couple of calls. Well, I should take that back. At that point, general practitioners like myself that were especially multi-doctor practices, I was getting calls and emails on a monthly basis from one of these companies. Hey, have you thought about selling? Blah, blah, blah. So I called a couple of the companies that I had some conversations with, hey, I'm not ready to sell yet, but well, can we at least come kind of tell you a little bit about us? Sure, let's do that. And so I met with them. And so I'd probably had conversations with 4 or 5 of those companies. And I called maybe the 2 that I kind of thought I wanted to sell to the most if my associate didn't buy my practice. And they came in and did a valuation, not nearly as involved as what I had just been through because they would do that if we actually got serious, but they would give me a ballpark on what they thought it was worth. And so I took that number to my associate, and she was initially interested, but shortly after that, COVID hit. And COVID was weird for my industry because we were deemed an essential business. So Colorado shut down a lot of businesses that were not deemed essential. If you were a small mom and pop appliance store, you got closed. If you were Home Depot, you got to stay open. Veterinarians were considered essential, so we got to stay open, but we couldn't let people in the building. So we had to go out in the parking lot and get the dog and bring him into the building and do whatever, and then call the owner on the phone. And it was a hassle, but we at least got to stay open. But 2 of my docs left during that time. One of them got pregnant, was having some health issues herself even before the pregnancy. Her baby before birth was having some issues. And of course, early on, they had no idea what COVID infection might mean for someone who is pregnant. And so her doc basically said, you have to stop working. You cannot work anymore. It's just too risky. Knowing what we know now probably wouldn't have been a big deal, but we just didn't know back then. So she quit completely. And then another one of my docs, COVID hit everybody a little bit differently. Some people, it bothered them a lot more than others. She was one of those people that really got nervous about the whole process and what it would mean. And wanted us to, a lot of the businesses put up those big plastic um, walls between you and the cashier or whatever, and you could just have a little hole to pass money through. She wanted to do that in our business, and I was like, I'm not sure that's going to help because we're not letting anybody in the building. It's like if we start letting people in the building, we can talk about that, but I'm not sure what we're protecting right now because nobody can come in. But that's just the level of concern that she had about the whole process. And then her child's school district went to 100% online school, and so she had a 12-year-old daughter, and she said, I don't want my 12-year-old daughter at home all day by herself. And so, fortunately for her husband had a big time job at Lockheed Martin, so they didn't need her salary. So she quit also, so she could be a stay-at-home mom. And she was the doc that was primarily interested in purchasing the practice. So I eventually got both of them replaced, but the new docs were not at all interested in buying me out. So it ultimately looked like I was going to wind up at some point. I was going to sell the practice. I mean, I don't want to work till I'm 75 years old. So at some point I'm going to have to sell. And it looked like I was going to have to sell corporate because the people I had working for me were not interested in buying it from me.
Very interesting. Awesome. So, Phil, we discussed the first thing that you recommend people do is to get a business valuation, whether that's at least understanding where your business sits in the market today, if you were going to list it for sale. But what is the second thing that you recommend business owners do as the next step beyond understanding where their business sits in the market?
Yeah, I would have an expert come in and kind of evaluate my profitability, my systems, my processes, even the footprint of my building, all that kind of stuff. There's people that do that for a living. Some of them are wanting to market your practice for you. Some of them are just wanting to make your practice as marketable as it can be. I know they do that in my industry. I'm sure they do it in other industries as well. I guess if the number that if you had your business evaluated and you're really happy with that number, you don't necessarily need to do anything else. But my experience is that these people coming in, they don't have to do much to make their money back. Unless you had to pay them 20, 25,000, 30,000, whatever it is, to come in and do that for you. In my industry, they're talking about multiples of between 10 and 16 times last year's net. They don't do gross anymore. It's all based on net. But if you're talking about anywhere from 10 to 16 times net, if they can make you an extra $10,000 a year, that's $100,000 that they're going to make you at the time of your sale. So if you can come in and have somebody make your business as profitable as possible for the 2 years before you're going to sell, I think that's a huge, huge step in your favor.
I love it. And shameless plug, that is what we do as well. So we do help people with that part of the equation.
Perfect.
So I
So they should
appreciate
call you.
I appreciate you saying this
Yeah.
because
I wish I
that
had
was
called you.
unsolicited. I'll tell everybody this right now. I did not
Yeah.
tee that up in any way, shape, or form. But I do appreciate the honesty and the honest answer there. And you're right. When you look at different ways of evaluating the cost of bringing on an expert, it's helpful to understand where you make the value back, right? Because everybody needs to bring value to the table. So I do appreciate that answer, honestly. So understand where you're at, understand how to build your business, tweak the business in a way that makes sense so that you are maximizing your profitability. And if you had to do it again, how soon would you have started that process of getting your business evaluated and looking at your systems and your procedures and optimization for revenue? Like how long before you started going down the path of exit would you have started that process?
Yeah, honestly, I think you need to start it between 3 and 5 years before you want to sell. Because the reality is, once they come in and make the recommendations that they want to make, and you have a time to implement those, you need a full 2 years of that extra profitability before you market your practice. So let's say it's going to take them 6 months or so to come in and evaluate. It's going to take you 6 months to implement what they want you to evaluate. Now you've got 2 full years to run the business at that higher profitability level. Now I can go and market my practice.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I mean, these are great words of wisdom from somebody that has been there and done that. What do you think would be some of the things industry specific from a veterinarian's perspective of having a practice and selling it? Is there anything unique about a veterinarian selling their practice that people should be aware of?
Well, I don't know how unique some of this is because I've never sold any other kind of business. So, yeah, just because I did it doesn't, I don't know if other people will be doing it or not with different kind of businesses. Certainly, I think with my business, which may not be true of every business, they definitely want me to stick around for a while. There's a lot of client loyalty, people that are calling my practice to get an appointment. There's a lot of them that want to see me or any one of the other docs. We encourage our clients to pick a doc they like and stay with them, assuming that they're there. I mean, if they wanted to see me today, they couldn't have because I'm not working today. But if it's not an emergency, I'm going to know your dog better than someone who's never seen your dog. A perfect example. I used to have a dog that came in, and I swear that this dog had ADHD. I mean, this dog was bouncing off the walls the entire time we were there. Nice dog, just nuts. I mean, just crazy nuts. And I walked in that exam room one day and he was acting like a normal dog. And I went, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong?" And the owner went, "Right? Look at him. He's not normal." And if you didn't know the dog, you would walk in and go, "Well, there's nothing wrong with this dog. He looks like a normal dog." But it was not normal for this dog. So there's a lot of, I think, client loyalty. If you're a good doc, the people and they trust you, they want to see you. So there's going to be a significant numbers, depending on who you sell to and what the terms of those sales are, that are going to want you to hang around for a while. So you need to keep that in mind. If you're like, I want to be done in 2 years, well, you should have sold 2 years ago. you because you're not going to be able to get this practice sold and be out of it in 2 years. They're gonna want you to stick around for 2 years after the sale's finalized, which is going to take close to a year.
That's excellent. I appreciate you saying that as well, because I want you to be able to have a conversation right now. If you're sitting across the table from another veterinarian that's trying to sell their practice, you're looking at them in the face and they're like, okay, what do you say to them?
In terms of next steps,
Yeah, like what do you say to them as far as, they want to sell their practice, they don't know how, and it's veterinarian to veterinarian. What are the key first principles of this process that you want to pass on to somebody
yeah.
else that was in your shoes a few years ago?
So I would say number one, when do you want to be done? When do you want your last day of work to be? I would say number two, what is your ultimate goal when you sell? Is your ultimate goal to maximize the money? You don't care who you sell to, you just want the top amount of dollars? Is your ultimate goal to make sure that your staff and your clientele are well taken care of, and you're willing to give away some money at the table to make sure that you've got some good feelings when you walk out the door? Is your ultimate goal to be done as soon as you sell? Because there are companies that will do that, but you're not going to get as much money if you do it that way. So I think you need to know what your goal is when you sell. What do you want this to look like afterwards?
I think that is spot on. Phil, you are amazing at this.
Well, I've done it a couple times now.
Yeah, that is. I mean, that is words of wisdom from somebody that you could tell that you've done this before more than a couple times. So, the, let, I want to bring the conversation a little bit more now. Back to you,
Okay.
right? So how did you know that it was time to sell your second general practice, right? The general practice part that
Yeah.
you had, yeah, I mean, that's been part of your heritage. It's part of your almost like an extra limb, right? At this point, I mean, since 1960, your family has been doing this. And talk to me about that journey of, all right, now I'm moving in this direction to be done, right?
Yeah.
With this part of my life.
So I'm 67. At some point I need to be done. But also I've been doing this for a long time. I mean, I graduated from vet school in 1983. So, in May it'll be 43 years in the same clinic. I mean, I've done some other stuff. I worked some night duty when I started. For about 4 years I was working as an ER doc at that central facility we talked about earlier. I worked part-time as director of medicine at that same facility in the early 2000s, from about 2000 to about 2015. But I've been in this same building where I'm practicing right now since 1983.
Amazing, by the way.
So, at some point you feel like, hey, maybe it's just time to do something else. I don't know that I'm ready to quit working, but I'm kind of ready to do something a little different. I will tell you that at my core, I'm a teacher. I love to teach. And I think that's the part of my practice that I've enjoyed the most. During COVID, this is kind of, I don't know, I'm getting off track here a little bit. You can stop me. You can edit this out, I guess, if you want to. Um, During COVID, a friend of mine, wound up with some extra tickets to the World Leadership Conference, and it was 100% online at that point because it was COVID. And so he said, "Hey, why don't you check this out and see? It might be interesting." So I said, "Sure, I'll do it. Just online. What the heck?" One of the people that I heard speak at that conference was Patrick Lencioni. You probably have heard of him. His company's called the Table Group. They're a team productivity, a business productivity consulting firm. He's got a bunch of bestsellers out: The Ideal Team Player, Six Types of Working Genius, Five Dysfunctions of a Team, whole bunch of books like that. Well, he was one of the speakers, and he had just developed this new productivity tool called Six Types of Working Genius. And I watched the lecture about that, and the concepts I found fascinating. They developed an assessment to help you understand what your geniuses were. The concept really is that there's 6 things that are required to make a team productive, and everyone's good at 2 of them. Everyone is generally competent at 2 of them, and everyone has 2 that are frustrations. Doesn't mean you can't do them, but it requires a tremendous amount of energy for you to do them. And if you're required to do them much, you're going to burn out at that job. And they developed an assessment to help you understand which 2 you had. And then there's a way to put all your assessments together as a team. Anyway, I found it fascinating. And at the end of the lecture, he said, "Well, if you want to know more, here's my email address. Just email me and we'll send you more information." So I emailed him. And as part of the registration for the World Leadership Conference, you got to take the assessment yourself. And they would send the results back to you. So I took it and got the results. And I thought, wow, this is really, really accurate. I've done some of the other ones. I've done, strength finders and Myers-Briggs and the one where you're a number and the one where you're a golden retriever. I can't remember the names of those, but I found this one to be not only the most accurate, but the most useful in terms of, now that I have the information, what do I do with it? How do I take this back to work and use this information to make things better where I work? Strength Finders was fascinating, but I didn't really know how to do anything with that information once I had it, except for understand myself better. Anyway, emailed him. He emailed me back and said, "Hey, we're getting ready to teach people how to facilitate this process. Would you like to be part of the beta group?" And I said, "I would love to be part of the beta group." So Lencioni and his team trained, I don't know, we had 40 or 50 of us, I guess, in that first group to be what he calls working genius facilitators. So I kind of got into that a little bit during COVID. I find it fascinating. I find it enjoyable. I'm kind of starting to do a little bit more of that. And I thought that might be a good time to maybe transition away from what I've done for 43 years into something that's even maybe more fun and more feeds my soul, I guess, a little bit more. If you're working inside your genius, it's one of those deals where you can't wait to get to work the next day. My dad loved veterinary medicine so much that he would have done it for free. If he didn't need the money and they said, "Hey, you can retire today," he still would have showed up at work because he loved doing it. And if they would have said, "Hey, you can show up and work, but we're not going to pay you," he still would have done it because he loved it. I've enjoyed being a veterinarian. I don't know that I would do it for free. So, uh, but honestly, some of this working genius stuff, I probably would. In fact, I have done it for free. I can tell you that I've done it for free. That kind of stuff. So I just felt, getting back to your original question, it was time to do something different. And I had a couple of irons in the fire that I was enjoying. And so I kind of felt like maybe it's time to go ahead and sell. And then this other thing that I'm doing that I really like, if I want to do it for free, I can. I won't need the money. I don't have to have the income. And I can just do what I want to do. I can do it as much or as little as I want, and just really enjoy the second half of my life. The other thing that I will tell you, I read a book by his last name is Buford. I can't think of his first name, but the book is From Success to Significance. And the concept of the book is that you've been a very successful businessman. You've maybe achieved most of your goals. How do you make the second half of your life significant as opposed to successful? And I think this is maybe a way for me to also, not that I haven't been significant in what I've been doing. I certainly think I've made a difference, certainly in some pets' lives, hopefully maybe in some owners' lives as well. But this is a way for me to help people, I think, be happier in the work that they're doing. And so it was just time. I guess that's the easiest way for me to say it. It was time for me to maybe do something a little bit different. And I had a couple things that I wanted to pursue.
I think that is absolutely beautiful because it's so important that people that are looking for these major or looking to have this a major life transitions, that they always know what they're going towards. And because I don't know if you know this, but only 1 out of 4 business owners are happy with selling their business within 12 months. 3 out of 4 are upset that they sold their business within 12 months.
Oh, wow. I
Of
did not know that.
Yeah, it's staggering the statistics that are out there, and it's a lot has to do with this concept of they don't know what it is that they're what's the next chapter, right? What is the next
Yeah.
chapter? Because I believe, like anybody that's an entrepreneur, I mean, we all know each other too well. Retirement is not in our vocabulary. I've never met a single entrepreneur that has ever said, "Yeah, I'd like to retire and do nothing." Like
Yeah, exactly.
I've I've not I don't know. I mean, maybe there's one out there, but I haven't found him yet. So, and so that's why for me, I feel like this is so important that people really spend some time reflecting on themselves and what brings them joy. What do they want to spend the years of their life with? And not it's not retreating. Like selling your business is not a retreat, right? You're not trying to get out or you're not shirking responsibilities, but you're moving on. It's like graduating, right? It's just graduating to another chapter. You know, there's still things to be done, and now having this conversation just with you, Phil, in the last hour or so, I could tell that you're somebody that really loves to give back and you love to teach, and I feel like we just need more of that in our country, right? We need more of this where the younger generations can learn from the older generations, much like many, many centuries past, right? I feel like maybe modern Western culture maybe has lost a little bit of that passing of the torch and passing on of knowledge and learning from those that have gone and tread the path before us. So maybe
Yeah,
that's
I
just
agree.
me. This has really been a great conversation, and you've really hit a lot of really good points that people should be considering. So you already answered my next question, which was what is next? Like what's going on for you? And I look forward to hearing about and staying in touch with you and learning about this journey of leadership development for the next generation. But before we close, I do want to ask you: are you happy with how everything's shaken out with your negotiations?
I am, and I think a significant part of that was the broker that I choose to use to market my practice. And same thing there. Not only did I get a whole bunch of mailers and phone calls and emails and stuff, hey, and we want to buy your practice. I got several, hey, we want to sell your practice for you. And I looked into them pretty hard. And the one that I wound up choosing, I've been very happy with. One of the first things they did was sit down with me and say, okay, what do you want to accomplish? What's important to you in part of this sale? And for me, it was very important that I take care of my staff. I've got staff that's been with me for 15, 20 years. I've got, a legacy that I wanted to protect. My dad started the practice in 1960. I've been there since 1983. I've got clients that literally are saying, hey, my grandpa used to bring his dog to your dad. And it was important to me that I felt like I was putting those people in good hands. It was important to me, like, when I sold to VCA, the other facility, the transition wasn't maybe as smooth as I would have liked, and some of my staff didn't necessarily like working for them. And I wanted to make sure that that didn't happen for the staff at my clinic. So I made that a high priority that I needed to be very comfortable with who bought the practice and the changes they would be making and that 100% of my staff would be guaranteed to have jobs as long as they were performing. They wouldn't come in and cut staff and all that kind of stuff or bring in their own people or any of that kind of stuff. And so the broker that I chose, they only sell veterinary practices. They don't do anything else, and they have been doing it long enough that they know who does what. So they were able to say, okay, well, they're not ever going to say don't sell to these people, they're bad, but they can say based on what you're telling me, we're gonna maybe market your practice to a smaller group of companies. They also know which companies are in the market. They know which companies are in the market for a practice my size. Some of them don't want you unless you're grossing at least 5 million. And I wasn't. So they know who might be interested, and then they can kind of put it out there. They wound up putting out my marketing my practice to 40 different companies. So it wasn't like they were limiting it to three. It still was 40 different companies, but they eliminated maybe 15 or 20 because of either the what my goals were they knew wouldn't fit with this particular company, or maybe because the company wasn't interested in a practice my size or whatever. And then they helped me kind of weed through some of the offers in terms of what they meant. And, if you do it this way, this is what this is going to mean. And they also, the lawyer that I wound up using to evaluate the practices was a referral from them. They said, hey, we've used this lady in the past. She's awesome. She's closed about a half a dozen deals with Heartland. She's closed probably 30 deals with us, with various companies, but 5 of them with the company that you're selling to or that I ultimately wound up choosing. And yeah, I've been very happy. The company that I wound up buying with has been great. They were exactly what I hoped for in terms of how they're treating my staff. I'm still working for them. I got another 2 years minimum. I mean, they're not going to kick me out the door in 2 years. But at the end of 27 would be the earliest that I could leave if I wanted to. And we'll make that determination down the road. But certainly at this point, I'm happy with how it's gone so far.
That's awesome. So you found a company or a brokerage that listened and they heard what your preferences were on the exit, and they were able to match your preferences and the size of your deal and the company to the right buyers. And that was super
Yes.
important. That made
Yes.
the process go super well. Yeah. No, I love it. That sounds like you did really well.
Yeah. I've been very happy.
Awesome. Well, this has been a fantastic episode. I know I have learned a ton from you. I look forward to staying in touch with you long term to hear about all the leadership developments. And so, thank you very much for your time, Phil. I'll give you the last word. any business owner out there that you want to talk to, what do you want to say to them right now?
Just make sure you know what you're doing. Don't be afraid to get some help, get some expertise. You've run your business, you know how to run your business. Do you know how to sell your business? And you may not. And so get some help with that. Don't be afraid to, ask for some help. A lot of us don't like to ask for help. You will be much happier. You won't be one of those 1 in 3 business owners that's unhappy after they sold their business, because you know what you're getting into.
Yep, absolutely. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I couldn't leave it on a better note. Phil, thanks so much for being here. Everybody, thanks so much. We'll see you all next time.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely.